continued to meet together in the temple courts. I often picture the early church meeting in homes as described in Acts chapter 2. I imagine that as their typical point of connection. But Acts 2:46 reminds me that not only did they meet for fellowship and teaching, but also they met in the temple courts to worship. With so many new believers and a daily growing number, the temple courts were probably the only way that they could see the whole group. Being together to worship was a time when the oneness of the early church connected the most. For many years, according to the book of Acts, Jesus' followers still value gathering in the temple to worship. Peter and John heal a beggar while going into the temple. They preach in the temple in Acts chapter 3. They're arrested there in Acts chapter 4. Of course, as Jesus' followers, they continued to go to the temple because Jesus' own custom was to go to the temple or synagogue wherever he was. I'm sure instead of temple worship being less important to these new believers, it became more important as they understood Jesus as being the fulfillment of all that they had known in worship. In fact, worship must have also taken on a new power as they were now infused with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. No doubt they began to experience worship differently. Instead of just depending on outward aids like symbols or liturgy or personal leadership, they were now learning to be led by the Holy Spirit that was within them. In fact, they were no longer dependent on being in the temple physically or having man's leadership to worship. Now they could authentically worship wherever and whenever. Yet, they continued to value meeting together for worship experiences. Even a cursory reading of the New Testament epistles will make it obvious that we were meant to be together in community. We belong together. The mutual indwelling of the Holy Spirit demands company. If you think about it, the whole narrative of the Bible begins with oneness, the Trinity within itself, God with creation, and then God with man. And yet because of sin, there is introduced division and separation. And in the rest of the narrative, you see this fragmenting and distance. Things like the exile show us a separating between man and God. But then God intervenes by sending His Son Jesus, a Redeemer brought to bring us back to God, bring us to oneness with Him, and bring us in community and in oneness with one another in the church. And ultimately, you see that picture in heaven that is so beautiful, the worship service where all of us are gathered together, not groups of individuals, or not even individuals, but it's really about a collective unity who are there, of the redeemed, who are there to worship. In Romans, Paul, one of the main reasons Paul is writing to that group, he's writing to a fractured group of house churches, and he's writing to call them out of division, and they're divided along ethnic lines. If you read chapter 16, you will see a long list of names in house churches, and they're divided among Roman and Greek and Jews. So he writes this epistle to call them back to unity. Because apparently, without the ability to meet in a larger group and share in worship, they tended to separate into their ethnic, cultural, hey, you're like me type of groups. And that's not congruent with that heavenly vision that we see in Revelation. There is a beauty in diversity, and that is the church. Each of us brings our own experiences into worship. As we worship God simultaneously, but in proximity, those shared experiences create this beautiful offering before the Lord. You might picture it like a symphony orchestra. There's flutes and oboes, but also tubas and trumpets and percussion instruments. Such diversity, but all together, when they're together, they're offering this beautiful offering in their unity that can't be achieved on an individual level. We know God all the more deeply, not only because of our shared experience in the moment of worship, but also because of the synergy of sharing our various experiences in the Lord as we come together. One of the songs that the early church sang at the temple was Psalm 34, which says, "Glorify the Lord with me. Let's exalt His name together." Again, in Psalm 95, they would sing, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord." Those psalm writers knew that there was something powerful about the togetherness of worship. Even with the new worship leader, if you will, of the Holy Spirit within them, the early church continued to have shared worship experience with the larger group. I had a really cool experience last week. I jumped on Facebook and saw that someone from my friend list called King Derek Munghunu from Uganda was getting on live. I was really curious. He was my friend, but I have no idea. I've never met King Derek before. It turns out that we have one mutual friend. That was a friend of mine who went to Uganda on a mission trip. So apparently Derek friend requested me because I was on his friend list. But anyway, when I saw that he was going to be on live, not knowing who he was, I was curious. So I clicked onto his live stream, and it was a worship experience. It was him and his wife, and they were just singing and just beautifully pouring out their heart toward the Lord. So I sang along with them, and just had a few minutes where, even though they didn't see me or know me, and I've never met him before, he is from a different culture and lives thousands of miles away. In that moment, we connected together and shared a worship experience to sing to the great God who has saved both of us and brought us new life. The same Lord